The golden hues of the late afternoon sun bathed the quiet town of Maplewood, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. A crisp autumn breeze rustled through the trees, sending a cascade of burnt orange leaves fluttering down the empty street. It was the kind of peaceful day where time seemed to stretch lazily, where the world felt warm and safe. Isabella pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she guided the grocery cart toward her car, her 2.5-year-old son, Zachary, toddling beside her with an excited bounce in his step. He clutched a small stuffed puppy in his chubby hands, his constant companion, a gift from his late father. To him, it was not just a toy. It was a protector, a silent friend who had been with him through every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every whispered secret only a child could imagine. As she buckled Zachary into his car seat, she felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. Being a single mother was never easy, and though she had created a safe world for her son, there were still moments when uncertainty pressed in, unspoken fears lurking at the edge of her mind. She had long since learned to push them aside, to keep moving forward because stopping meant facing the past, and that was something she wasn't ready to do. The drive home was quiet, with Zachary humming a soft tune from the back seat, the gentle rhythm of the tires against the pavement, lulling the town into an early evening slumber. As they turned onto their street, the familiar sight of their cozy little house came into view, nestled between two towering maples, its white picket fence now dusted with fallen leaves. But today, something was different. Zachary was the first to notice. As Isabella parked and opened her door, he gasped, his tiny hand pointing toward the neighboring house, the one that belonged to Jack, the quiet old man who rarely spoke to anyone. At first, she didn't see what had caught Zachary's attention, but then, just beyond the iron gate of Jack's yard, she saw it. A dog. Not just any dog. A large, shadowy figure stood motionless, half hidden by the dimming light and the creeping dusk. It was lean, almost gaunt, its fur matted and dull, its posture stiff with wariness. But what struck Isabella the most was its eyes, dark, tired, filled with something she couldn't quite name. Not aggression, not fear, something deeper. "Mama, look!" Zachary's voice was filled with wonder rather than fear, his little legs kicking in excitement. "A puppy!" Isabella's stomach twisted. That was no puppy. "Stay in the car, Zachary," she said gently but firmly, her voice laced with quiet authority. Zachary pouted but obeyed, clutching his stuffed puppy tighter as he stared through the window at the mysterious animal. Isabella stepped forward cautiously, her instincts kicking in immediately. She had spent years as a veterinarian before she walked away from it all, before she decided she couldn't bear to witness another moment of helplessness. She knew the signs of a stray, could read a dog's body language as easily as she read bedtime stories to her son. This dog wasn't wild. It wasn't feral. It was waiting. Her eyes flicked toward Jack's house. The old man stood on his porch, leaning against the railing, watching. A cigarette dangled between his fingers, the ember glowing faintly in the fading light. "You know that dog?" she asked, her voice carrying across the quiet space between them. Jack exhaled slowly, a plume of smoke curling in the air before vanishing. "Not yet," he said simply. Isabella glanced back at the animal. It hadn't moved, but its eyes were locked onto her, unwavering, assessing. She wasn't sure whether it was waiting for an invitation or simply too exhausted to run. "Has it been here long?" "A few days," Jack replied, his voice calm, unreadable. "Shows up at dusk, leaves by morning." She frowned. That meant it wasn't just passing through. It had chosen this place, this house. But why? "Looks like it's been through hell," she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to Jack. He nodded once. "Most of us have." There was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely, but before she could say anything, a tiny voice interrupted. "Can we keep him?" Her breath hitched. She turned to see Zachary standing outside the car, his wide blue eyes filled with innocent hope. "Zachary, I told you to stay inside," she said, her voice softer this time. "But Mama," he whispered, his little fingers twisting in the hem of his sweater. "He's sad." Isabella's heart clenched. She looked back at the dog, at the silent plea hidden behind its tired stance. It didn't move toward them, but it also didn't retreat. There was something deeply human in the way it stood. Hesitant, waiting, as if it had been turned away too many times before. Jack flicked his cigarette away, watching the embers fizzle against the damp earth. "That dog's seen things," he murmured. "The kind of things that don't just go away." Isabella swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her like an unseen burden. She should walk away. She should scoop up Zachary, lock the door, pretend she never saw those eyes staring back at her. But she couldn't. Instead, she knelt down, leveling her gaze with her son's. "He's not a pet, sweetheart," she said gently. "He's lost. And sometimes, lost things don't want to be found." Zachary's lower lip trembled, but he nodded. He was young, but he understood sadness better than most. Isabella turned back to Jack. "What are you going to do?" He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Not my decision to make." The words settled uneasily in her chest, because deep down, she knew. This dog had already made its decision. It was just waiting to see if they would do the same. The wind carried the last remnants of autumn through the town of Maplewood, whispering secrets between the brittle leaves that danced across the pavement. The streetlights flickered to life as dusk settled in, casting long shadows over Isabella's porch. Inside, she sat on the couch, cradling a warm cup of tea between her hands, though she hardly took a sip. The image of the dog, Zeus, as Jack had called him, lingered in her mind far longer than she wanted to admit. She told herself it didn't matter. He wasn't her responsibility, but the truth was, she had seen something in those dark, tired eyes, something hauntingly familiar. A quiet plea, a battle-worn soul waiting on the edge of a world that had already turned its back on him. "Mommy?" A small voice broke the silence. She turned to see Zachary standing in the hallway, rubbing his sleepy eyes, his tiny stuffed puppy tucked under one arm. "Can I give him food tomorrow?" he asked, his voice soft but determined. Isabella sighed, setting down her cup. "Zachary, sweetie, we don't know if he's safe. He's a stray." "But he's hungry," Zachary said, his little brow furrowing. "And sad. You saw him too, right?" She hesitated. Yes, she had seen him. She had seen the way he stood, rigid yet exhausted, as if waiting for someone to decide whether he was allowed to stay or had to keep running. She had spent years trying to ignore that same feeling buried deep within herself. But that wasn't something she could explain to a 2.5-year-old. "Go to bed, sweetheart," she said instead, brushing his golden curls from his face. "We'll talk about it in the morning." Zachary pouted but nodded, shuffling back to his room. Isabella stayed in the living room long after he had fallen asleep, staring out the window at the empty yard next door, wondering if Zeus was still out there. The next morning, Zachary woke early, filled with excitement. As Isabella groggily prepared breakfast, she caught him sneaking toward the back door, a piece of toast in his tiny hand. "Zachary," she called. He froze mid-step, turning with the guilt of a child caught red-handed. "I was just—" She sighed, kneeling to his level. "I know you want to help him, but we have to be careful. Not all dogs are safe." Zachary looked at her with those big, earnest blue eyes. "But what if he's just waiting for someone to love him?" A sharp ache bloomed in her chest. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. Jack stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, looking as gruff as ever. "Morning," he greeted, his gaze flicking to Zachary's toast. "Looks like someone's got breakfast plans." Isabella exhaled. He's convinced Zeus is just misunderstood. Jack's mouth twitched in the ghost of a smile. Smart kid. She folded her arms. "And what do you think?" Jack shrugged. "I think some dogs get a raw deal, and I think if Zeus wanted to hurt anyone, he would have done it already." She hated that he had a point. "I'm not saying bring him inside and let him sleep on your bed," Jack continued. "But maybe he just needs a reason to trust again." She chewed on her lip, torn between instinct and something deeper. Then, reluctantly, she opened the door a little wider. "Fine. But if he bites my kid, it's on you." Jack smirked. Duly noted. That afternoon, Zeus was still there. He lay near Jack's fence, his body curled tightly as if conserving the last of his warmth. His ears twitched at their approach, but he didn't move. He was waiting. Jack took a slow step forward, crouching near him. "Hey, boy," he murmured. "Still sticking around, huh?" Zeus lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes wary but not hostile. Zachary, too small to understand fear, beamed and held out a piece of toast. "Here, puppy." Isabella tensed, but Zeus only sniffed the air, his nose twitching, before inching forward. Slowly, cautiously, he took the bread from Zachary's fingers, not with the desperation of a starving animal, but with a carefulness that almost felt respectful. Isabella's breath caught. Zachary giggled. "See, Mommy? He's nice." Zeus swallowed the bread and licked his lips, then did something Isabella wasn't expecting. He laid his head back down, his body visibly relaxing for the first time. Jack exhaled, watching the dog closely. "That's trust," he muttered. "Right there. You don't see that every day." Isabella wasn't sure what unnerved her more, the fact that a stray dog had just earned her son's complete devotion, or the way her own heart clenched at the sight of him finally letting his guard down. As the days passed, Zeus didn't leave. He never approached first, never demanded anything. But every morning, he was there. Zachary took it upon himself to be his friend. He sat in the grass, chattering away as if the dog understood every word. Sometimes, Zeus would flick his ears in response. Other times, he would simply listen, his tail giving a faint thump when Zachary laughed. Jack, despite his gruff exterior, had started leaving small bowls of water on the porch, though he never admitted to it. "Must be the wind knocking those over every night," he muttered when Isabella caught him refilling them. And Isabella, against her better judgment, began to watch Zeus differently. She started noticing things. The way he would stiffen when sudden noises startled him, then force himself to relax. The way his eyes darted toward the horizon, like a soldier expecting orders that would never come. The way he positioned himself between Zachary and the street without ever seeming to mean to. He wasn't just a stray, he was something more. And that scared her. Because trust was a fragile thing, and she had learned long ago that the things you let yourself love were the things that could hurt you the most. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, she stood on her porch, arms wrapped around herself as she watched Zachary trace circles in the dirt with a stick. Zeus lay a few feet away, eyes half closed, but Isabella knew he was still aware of every movement. Jack stepped beside her. "You gonna keep pretending he's not part of the family?" She tensed. "He's not ours." Jack raised a brow. "Could have fooled me." She didn't answer, because the truth was, she wasn't sure anymore. Zeus had come into their lives like a ghost from a past she had tried to bury. And no matter how much she told herself she wasn't ready, that it was safer to keep her distance. She knew deep down it wasn't just Zeus who was learning to trust again. It was her, too. The night settled over Maplewood in a hush, wrapping the town in a heavy blanket of stillness. The world outside Isabella's window was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the brittle autumn leaves. The house, too, was silent, filled only with the rhythmic breathing of Zachary in the next room. He had fallen asleep quickly, his tiny arms curled around his stuffed puppy, safe and content in the warmth of his bed. But Isabella lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind restless. The image of Zeus lingered in her thoughts, his dark, searching eyes haunting her long after she had stepped away from the porch. There was something about him that unsettled her. Not fear, exactly, but a feeling she couldn't quite name. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to push it away. Sleep finally came, but it brought no peace. In the depths of her dreams, she was back in the sterile white walls of the veterinary clinic. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and suffocating. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. And there, on the cold metal table, lay a dog, a German shepherd, his breathing ragged, his fur stained with blood. She pressed down harder on his wound, her hands slick and trembling. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a desperate plea. "Just hold on." The dog's eyes found hers. They were filled with trust, unwavering, even as the life inside them flickered like a dying flame. A flat line, a piercing, endless sound that sent a knife through her chest. "No, no, no," she gasped, her hands pressing, shaking, useless against the inevitable. But the light had already faded from his eyes, and then, suddenly, those eyes were no longer the dog's. They were Zeus's. A violent clap of thunder ripped through the sky, shattering the dream. Isabella bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs, a cold sweat clinging to her skin. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The walls of her bedroom felt too close, too tight, trapping her in the ghosts of memories she had tried so hard to bury. She ran a shaky hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. It was just a dream, just the past, creeping in where it no longer belonged. But then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A low whimper, carried by the wind. Frowning, she pushed the covers off and moved to the window, peering out into the dark. And there he was. Zeus lay curled up near the fence, his body barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. Rain had begun to fall, light but steady, soaking into his already matted fur. He didn't move, didn't even try to find shelter. He simply lay there, silent and unmoving, as if he had accepted that this was where he belonged. Alone, in the cold. Isabella's fingers tightened on the windowsill. She had told herself she wouldn't care. She had told herself he wasn't her problem. But as she watched him lying there, something inside her cracked. Without thinking, she grabbed the blanket from the end of her bed and slipped out of her room. The house was silent, save for the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her bare feet. She hesitated briefly outside Zachary's door, glancing in to make sure he was still fast asleep. Then she stepped outside. The cold hit her instantly, the rain prickling against her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, gripping the blanket tightly as she approached the fence. Zeus didn't react at first. His ears twitched, but he remained still, watching her with quiet wariness. "You're going to freeze out here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She crouched down, holding out the blanket just slightly, unsure of what she expected. Zeus lifted his head, his nose twitching, but he didn't move closer. His eyes flickered between her and the offering in her hands, hesitant, uncertain. "I'm not going to hurt you," she found herself whispering, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to say it. Zeus stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he shifted. His muscles tensed as if expecting some unseen threat, but he didn't retreat. He was waiting. With careful movements, Isabella placed the blanket near him, just within reach. She didn't try to force it on him. Instead, she simply left it there, a silent invitation. Zeus glanced at her one last time before lowering his head back onto his paws. He didn't pull the blanket toward him, but he also didn't move away from it. It was the smallest of acknowledgments. A hesitant kind of trust. Isabella exhaled, standing back up. For a long moment, she just watched him, rain dripping from her hair, her heartbeat finally slowing. Then she turned and went back inside. She didn't check to see if he took the blanket. She didn't need to. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Isabella poured herself a cup of coffee. She still felt the weight of last night, the dream, the rain, the silent exchange with Zeus. She told herself she wouldn't check, that she wouldn't care. But as she stepped out onto the porch, her breath caught in her throat. The blanket was gone, not discarded or pushed aside, but gone. Her fingers curled around the coffee mug as she scanned the yard. Zeus was nowhere in sight, but something told her he wasn't far. "Mommy!" Zachary's excited voice rang out behind her, and she turned just as he came barreling through the door, his face lit up with joy. "Did you see? The puppy liked the blanket." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, sweetheart. I think he did." Zachary beamed. "That means he likes us, right?" She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, movement near the fence caught her eye. Zeus had returned. He stood a few feet away, watching them, his posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been before. And though he didn't come closer, there was something different about him now. He wasn't just waiting anymore. He was choosing to stay. Isabella's grip on her coffee mug loosened as she exhaled. Something had changed last night, not just for Zeus, but for her. Because when she had stepped outside and left that blanket behind, she hadn't just been offering him warmth. She had been offering him a reason to trust again. And maybe, just maybe, she was learning to do the same. The night had settled heavily over Maplewood, cloaking the quiet streets in darkness. A thin layer of mist clung to the pavement, swirling beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. The town, usually peaceful, seemed to hold its breath, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the edges of the light. Inside Isabella's home, all was still. She had finally convinced herself to get some rest, though sleep had not come easily in the past few nights. The presence of Zeus, unspoken yet undeniable, had disrupted the delicate balance she had created in her life. She told herself it was temporary, that he was still just a stray, lingering out of habit rather than attachment. But deep down, she knew better. And so did he. Outside, Zeus lay near the porch, his body curled loosely, his ears twitching at every subtle shift in the night air. His eyes remained half open, scanning the yard, the street, the house. Even in rest, he remained alert, watchful. It wasn't trust that had kept him here. Not yet. But something else, something instinctual, something buried deep within him, had told him that this place mattered. That the little boy who offered him food and spoke to him in endless streams of laughter mattered. That the woman who hesitated yet never turned away mattered. He didn't know why, but he knew it was true. The wind picked up, rustling the trees that lined the quiet street. Zeus's ears perked, his muscles tensing. Something had changed. A sound, a rustling that did not belong to the wind. Slowly he lifted his head, his dark eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. The street was empty, the neighborhood still. But something was wrong. Then, footsteps. Software measured. Too careful. Zeus's body went rigid. He rose to his feet, his tail low, his stance steady. His breath was slow, controlled. He had known this feeling before, the feeling of something just on the edge of danger, the moment before a threat revealed itself. And then he saw him, a figure, creeping along the side of the house, moving through the darkness with deliberate precision. He was dressed in black, his hood pulled low, his face obscured. Zeus did not move. He waited. The figure reached the back window, his gloved hands testing the frame. Click. The sound of the lock shifting. Zeus growled low in his throat, a deep, rumbling warning that cut through the silence like a blade. The man froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the weight of the night pressing in around them. Then, movement. The intruder turned, stepping back quickly, his hand reaching for something at his waist. Zeus didn't wait to see what it was. With one powerful lunge, he sprang forward, his muscles propelling him through the air. He hit the man hard, knocking him backward onto the damp ground. A sharp, startled curse cut through the night. The man thrashed, trying to push Zeus away, but the dog was relentless. Zeus's teeth clamped down on the man's arm, not tearing, not aiming to maim, just holding, just keeping him there, just letting him know he had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. The man struggled, but Zeus did not let go. His growl deepened, vibrating through his chest. The intruder panicked, his free hand clawing at the ground, reaching. A metallic glint. A knife. Zeus saw it. He moved faster. A sharp yelp tore through the night as the man's wrist twisted at an unnatural angle, the knife slipping from his grasp. Zeus's teeth had found their mark, biting down just enough to make him drop the weapon, but not enough to destroy. A light flicked on. Zeus. Isabella's voice. Another light. Jack's porch. The sudden glow of the house lights startled the intruder. With a final, desperate twist, he managed to yank himself free, scrambling to his feet, cradling his wounded wrist. Zeus lunged again, snapping his teeth just inches from the man's retreating form, then running. The man bolted into the night, disappearing down the empty street. Zeus didn't chase. He didn't need to. The danger had passed. But as he turned, his breath still heavy, his body still coiled with tension, he saw Isabella standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, her hand gripping the frame as if to steady herself. Zeus, she whispered again, this time not in fear but in something else, something closer to understanding. Then, from behind her, a smaller voice. Mommy? Zachary. His tiny frame appeared beside her, his sleepy eyes blinking in confusion. He looked at Zeus, then at his mother, then back at Zeus. And then, he smiled. You saved us, he said softly. Zeus exhaled, his tail giving a single slow wag. Jack appeared on his own porch, his gaze sweeping the scene before settling on the retreating shadow of the intruder in the distance. He let out a low whistle. Didn't think he'd go that far, he muttered. Isabella turned to him, her heart still hammering in her chest. You knew? Jack shrugged. Had a feeling someone's been watching the place. Thought maybe Zeus did too. She stared at him, then at the dog sitting calmly at her feet, the tension in his body finally easing. You let him stay, Jack said, crossing his arms. Maybe it's time to admit why. Isabella didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because for the first time since Zeus had arrived, she no longer saw him as a stray. She saw him for what he was, a protector, a guardian, a part of their family. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to let him be. The morning after the break-in felt different, not because of the golden rays streaming through the window or the peaceful hum of birds outside, but because something within Isabella had shifted. The coffee in her hands had gone cold as she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wooden surface, her mind replaying the events of the night before. Zeus had saved them. She still couldn't fully process it. This was the same dog she had kept at a distance, the same stray she had told herself she couldn't trust. And yet, in the moment that mattered most, he hadn't hesitated. He hadn't run. He had fought for them. For Zachary. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the mug to her lips, taking a small sip before setting it back down. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the fact that Zeus had protected them, or the fact that deep down she had known he would. Mommy! Mommy! Zachary's excited voice pulled her from her thoughts, followed by the soft patter of his feet racing toward her. She turned just as he skidded to a stop in the doorway, his face flushed with excitement. His golden curls bounced as he pointed toward the porch. "He's back!" Zachary beamed. "Zeus is back! He's waiting!" Isabella's breath caught. She wasn't surprised. Of course, he was still there. Slowly, she stood, smoothing a hand over her wrinkled pajama shirt. Zachary bounced beside her, his little hands gripping the edge of the table as he looked up at her expectantly. "Can we let him in now?" he asked, his voice softer this time, almost pleading. A part of her wanted to say yes immediately. Another part, the part that had spent years guarding herself from pain, from loss, from anything that felt too close, was still unsure. But Zeus had already proven himself. He had done something no one had asked him to do, something no stray dog should have cared enough to do. He had chosen them. Isabella inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "Stay here, sweetheart," she murmured, placing a gentle hand on Zachary's curls before stepping toward the front door. As she opened it, the crisp morning air greeted her, cool and refreshing. She stepped onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself as she looked down at the figure waiting patiently by the steps. Zeus sat still, his posture relaxed but attentive. His dark eyes met hers, unreadable yet calm, as if he knew she had a decision to make, and was giving her the space to make it. He wasn't begging. He wasn't desperate. He was simply waiting. Something about that made her chest tighten. For days, she had feared what he might be capable of, imagined worst-case scenarios where trust led to disaster. But now, standing here, watching him, she saw what had been in front of her all along, a dog that had been hurt, rejected, left behind, and yet still willing to trust again. Still willing to stay. She took a hesitant step forward. "Zeus," she said his name for the first time, testing how it felt on her tongue. His ears flicked slightly, but he remained still. Isabella swallowed, then knelt carefully, extending her hand toward him. She half expected him to flinch, to recoil like a dog that had learned not to expect kindness. But he didn't. He watched her for a long, silent moment, before lowering his head and slowly pressing his nose against her palm. Her fingers curled slightly, brushing against his fur. It was coarse, a little rough, but warm, real. A shaky exhale left her lips. "I guess we owe you a proper home," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Zeus's tail gave a slow, tentative wag. Behind her, a tiny gasp of joy sounded. "We're keeping him?" Zachary's voice was barely more than a breathless whisper. Isabella turned, meeting her son's hopeful blue eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly, ruffling his hair. "We're keeping him." Zachary let out an excited squeal before rushing forward, throwing his small arms around Zeus's thick neck. For a moment, Zeus stiffened. Then, he melted. His muscles relaxed under Zachary's touch, his tail wagging a little more freely as he allowed the child to bury his face in his fur. A chuckle came from the porch steps. "Well, I'll be damned." Isabella looked up to see Jack leaning against the railing, arms crossed over his chest, an amused but knowing expression on his face. "Didn't think I'd live to see the day you let that mutt through your front door," he mused. She rolled her eyes. "I didn't have much of a choice." Jack smirked. "That's the thing about the good ones. They don't ask for space in your life. They just carve their way in whether you're ready or not." Isabella looked down at Zeus, watching as he tolerated Zachary's enthusiastic affection with the patience of an old soul who had finally found a place to belong. Maybe Jack was right. Maybe some connections weren't about choosing to let someone in. Maybe sometimes they just happen, whether you're ready or not. Taking a deep breath, she straightened and stepped toward the front door. "Come on," she said, looking down at Zeus. "Let's go inside." Zeus hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, With quiet certainty, he followed. As he stepped over the threshold, something inside Isabella shifted, not just in her house, but in her heart. The walls she had built, the distance she had clung to, the fear she had carried for so long, they all cracked just a little. Trust wasn't about knowing every answer. Sometimes, it was about taking the first step, even when you were still afraid. And for the first time in a long time, Isabella was ready. The days following Zeus's arrival inside the house passed like the slow unraveling of a knot, one that had been wound tight for far too long. At first, Isabella found herself hyper-aware of his presence. She had spent so much time keeping him at a distance that having him inside felt almost unnatural. It wasn't that she feared him anymore, not after everything he had done for them, but trusting something, truly letting it in, was different than simply allowing it to exist nearby. Zeus, for his part, seemed to understand this. He never imposed himself. He moved through the house with quiet caution, his steps careful, his presence felt but never forced. He often stayed near the door, as if leaving Isabella space to change her mind, as if he still wasn't certain he had the right to be here. Zachary, of course, had no such reservations. The little boy adored Zeus in the way only a child could, fully, without hesitation, without condition. To Zachary, Zeus had never been a stray. He had never been something to fear. He had simply been a friend waiting to be found. "Come on, boy," Zachary would call every morning, urging Zeus to follow him through the house, down the hallway, onto the couch, where he'd pat the cushion beside him with determined little hands. At first, Zeus resisted, lingering at the threshold of whatever space Zachary occupied, like a guardian rather than a companion. But little by little, the walls between them crumbled. One evening, Isabella caught them curled up together on the living room floor, Zachary's tiny fingers buried in Zeus's fur, his head rising and falling in rhythm with the dog's steady breaths. A lump formed in her throat at the sight. She had spent so long fearing that letting Zeus in would be a risk. But looking at them now, she wondered, had she really been protecting Zachary? Or had she been protecting herself? One afternoon, as Isabella stepped outside to check the mailbox, Jack's voice drifted over from his porch. "So, how's life with the mutt treating you?" Isabella turned, squinting against the sun. "You mean the hero who saved my son's life?" "It's going well." Jack chuckled, rubbing his jaw. "Didn't think I'd ever see you take in another dog." She shifted, uncomfortable with how easily he could read her. "It's different this time." "Is it?" His gaze was knowing. "Dogs like him. They come with stories, Isabella. Not all of them have happy endings." She stiffened. "I know that. Do you?" Jack sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "I'm just saying, if you're keeping him, you have to be all in. No half-trust, no maybe one day. He's either family or he's not." Isabella knew what he meant. She had taken Zeus in, fed him, allowed him to stay, but had she truly accepted him? Had she truly let him belong? The answer came sooner than she expected. It was late, far past Zachary's bedtime, and the house was bathed in moonlight. The rhythmic ticking of the clock filled the quiet space as Isabella sat on the couch, flipping through an old photo album she had dug out from a forgotten box. She traced her fingers over the images. Her younger self, a different version of her life, one filled with promise and trust that had not yet been broken. A soft whimper broke her thoughts. Her eyes flickered toward Zeus, who lay curled near the doorway. His ears twitched, his breathing heavy, his paws shifting against the floor. Another whimper. Then, a deep, almost pained exhale. A nightmare. Her chest tightened. How many nights had he spent like this, alone? How many times had he fought unseen battles in his sleep, with no one to wake him, no one to reassure him he was safe? Without thinking, she moved. She knelt beside him, hesitating only a moment before placing a gentle hand on his back. "Zeus," she murmured softly. He jolted awake, his body stiffening beneath her touch. His breathing was uneven, his eyes wild for half a second before they focused on her. And then, he stilled. Recognition dawned, followed by something deeper. Relief. She stroked his fur gently. "You're safe," she whispered, unsure if the words were more for him or for herself. Zeus let out a slow breath and for the first time rested his head against her knee. She didn't move. She didn't want to. The next morning, Isabella woke to the sound of laughter. Peering groggily down the hallway, she spotted Zachary sitting cross-legged on the floor, tying an old red bandana around Zeus's neck. "There, now you're really part of the family," Zachary announced proudly, clapping his hands together. Zeus huffed through his nose, but he didn't shake the fabric off. Instead, his tail gave a slow, lazy wag. Something warm bloomed in Isabella's chest. Jack's words echoed in her mind. No half-trust. He's either family or he's not. She had been afraid of giving Zeus a place in their home because she knew what it meant. To let him in fully. To love him without condition. To accept the risk that love always carried. But what was love without risk? What was family if not the willingness to choose someone, over and over again, despite the unknown? That evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of amber, Isabella stood on the porch, watching Zachary play in the yard, Zeus never straying far from his side. Jack walked up beside her, hands in his pockets. "Looks like you made your choice." She exhaled, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I guess I did." He nodded approvingly. "Smart choice." A comfortable silence settled between them before Isabella spoke again. "You were right, you know," she admitted, "about being all in, about trusting him." Jack smirked. "I usually am." She rolled her eyes, but didn't argue, because Zeus wasn't just a stray anymore. He wasn't just the dog who had saved them. He was theirs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Zachary's laughter rang through the air, clear and uninhibited, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt something settle deep in her chest. Not just relief, not just acceptance, but belonging. She looked down at Zeus, reached a hand to scratch behind his ears, and whispered the words she knew he had been waiting to hear. "Welcome home." And this time, when Zeus looked up at her, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only trust, only love, only family. This heartwarming story goes beyond the typical dog stories about rescue and redemption. It is a powerful reflection on trust, healing, and the profound bonds we form when we least expect them. At its core, it speaks to the universal longing for connection, reminding us that sometimes the ones who need love the most are the ones who have been hurt before. Trust is a fragile thing, built not in grand gestures but in quiet moments of understanding, patience, and the willingness to see beyond fear. The story highlights how love is not always immediate, nor is it always easy, but when given a chance, it has the power to transform. Through the bond between human and dog, we see that healing is a two-way street. Sometimes it is not just about saving a lost soul, but allowing ourselves to be saved in return. It also challenges misconceptions, particularly about loyalty and second chances. True devotion isn't about where we come from, but about the choices we make. This story reminds us that family is not just defined by blood, but by the hearts that choose to stand by each other. It is a celebration of resilience, of learning to trust again, and of embracing the unexpected. Because in the end, the greatest love stories, whether between humans or dogs, are the ones where love is chosen time and time again.
Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.